with the traditional role of prosecutors. The question is, in my view, I think it reflects that issue. What is the role of a prosecutor in fighting crime? I would say probably I'd rather phrase that question as what is the role of a prosecutor in reducing crime. Nevertheless, I want to look to my panelists now to inform us more about this aspect. And I suppose I'll turn to Chauncey Parker first. Chauncey, I'd like you obviously to reflect on what the current role of the prosecutor is in fighting or reducing crime, and then, in your opinion, what it should be. Chauncey?
Thanks, Peter. I think that the goal in the district attorney's office, I think the goal of government is to protect people and to make our communities as safe as possible. And DA's offices play an important role of that, always seeking justice, within the parameters of seeking justice. But I think that we play a vital role in reducing crime. I think the traditional role that we play is that we have a very serious case of defendants arrested for a gunpoint robbery or murder or any kind of case like that, and by prosecuting that case effectively and fairly and thoroughly and justice is done, there's a role in reducing crime that a dangerous person is taken off the street, so to speak. I think that's sort of the traditional role of a prosecutor. I think the 21st century role of a prosecutor is to think much more broadly, not as reactively as you said earlier, but thinking that there's more that we can do as prosecutors to be more effective in our prosecution decisions, and they could be not case by case making decisions as a prosecutor, but also looking at the crime, the offender, in the context of the community, in the context of the crime. So, for example, it could be that somebody who is on parole gets arrested with a knife, and we could prosecute that as in the traditional way. What's the penalty for somebody illegally possessing a knife or drugs or something like that? It could be, though, that person, if we had better connections with the community, better intelligence, we could find out a person's been involved in a shooting or some other serious crime, and we're not able to prosecute it because the witness has been intimidated or this or that, and there may be an opportunity to be tougher in our decisions. On the other hand, there also can be cases, whether it's alternatives to incarceration and things like that, where we can be much smarter, where the traditional response may not be the way to go. There may be other ways that may more effectively reduce crime, either through drug treatment or community programs or something like that. So I think the way I think it should be is that we should have we should be able to prosecute cases in context, not one after another what comes to the door, but look at the crime, the offender, the neighborhood, and be able to make the smartest decisions, always with the goal of what's going to be most effective at enhancing public safety.
So while we're waiting, sorry, I lost sound on my phone. Is everybody there? This is Brent Berkeley.
Sorry, I'm not. I had my mute button on, Brent. My apologies. I was saying we'll turn to you. I wanted to thank Chauncey for his input, and the fact I wanted to congratulate him and his boss for his title, Executive Assistant for Crime Prevention Strategies. And now I wanted to turn to you, Brent, to get your sense of the role of the prosecutor and what the role should be in fighting or reducing crime.
All right, thank you, Peter. And again, it's my pleasure to be here. I think when we look at the role of the prosecutor within the criminal justice system, I think one of the things that is incumbent on us is to look at the unfortunate recent downslide in the reputation of our profession over the last decade or so. It seems like it's on a fairly regular basis. You see on the news something that has caused prosecutors throughout the country to be subject to some criticism. Unfortunately, I think that there are a lot of forces that are working hard to paint the prosecution profession as a type of a monolithic, win at all costs, all we care about are convictions type of a profession. And certainly, I think that there have been some instances that certainly justify that opinion. But for the most part, prosecutors are very conscientious and very much concerned with truly doing justice. But when you really look at what the true role and what the mission of prosecutors is. Over the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time working with prosecutors from all over the United States and even internationally. And there's a big discrepancy in even how we as prosecutors view our jobs. Some of the responses I've gotten when I ask prosecutors, what is your job or what is your mission? I've heard them say, well, my job is to fill the jails, or my job is to punish criminals or enforce the law, or even, unfortunately, some people say, well, my job seems to be nothing but processing this vast amount of cases that we have. And I think those are some somewhat unfortunate responses. At the same time, I also get responses that, well, my job is to do good, or to seek justice, or to protect victims. And I think all of those are very appropriate, and certainly in some cases, our job is to do that traditional punish criminals, react to a case, and prosecute those that have violated the law, and it's certainly something that we need to do. However, I think with the amount of power and influence that prosecutors have, I think it's incumbent on us to do what we can in an effort to reduce crime and improve public safety. So I think with the advent of and the evolution and the increased acceptance of community prosecution and evidence-based practices over the last few years, I think our role is expanding and evolving as prosecutors. We're becoming involved in diversion and prevention programs. There's a lot of prosecutor-based reentry programs and all other types of functions that really fall outside what might be considered the traditional purview of prosecutors. And so when you roll all of these functions, from the trial advocacy function to the prevention and reentry, working with drug courts and mental health courts, when you look at all that, I think what you can really say the mission of the prosecutor is to improve the quality of life in our community. And so I think when you look at it from that point of view, yes, we still have to engage in those traditional prosecution methods, but by utilizing community prosecution and evidence-based prosecutions, we can step beyond that and create partnerships and programs that help us identify trends in crime, identify neighborhoods and problem areas that we can focus on in order to bring down the overall level of crime and increase the level of public safety within our communities.
Great, Brent. Appreciate your perspectives, and of course, coming from the National Center for Community Prosecutions, I expected as much. Roy Austin, would it be fair to ask you, of course, from the federal perspective, does the amount of resources and perhaps a different caseload give you a different perspective on what is the role of the prosecutors and what should be the role of the prosecutor? Do you and your colleagues have more time to reflect on these matters?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have any more time. We still go under that 24-hour-a-day schedule that many of the rest of us have to do. And the problem is that we really aren't doing anything different. I think, as Brent very aptly put it, the job of the prosecutor is to improve the quality of life in our communities. The difference is, for me coming from the Department of Justice as my community, is the entire country. So I have a slightly larger community, but the same goal. And I kind of break it down into four different things that a prosecutor's job is. And first and foremost is to increase fairness and safety. Secondly, is to help victims and witnesses navigate and understand the justice system. Thirdly, it's determining alternatives to incarceration and penalties that reduce recidivism. And fourthly, it is to protect the Constitution. As far as increasing fairness and safety, I think, we think of prosecutors, we almost always think of, homicides and rapes and murders. But remember, we also do a lot of white-collar stuff, and increasing fairness is making people play by the rules. It is going in and looking at corporations and are they following the rules. It's looking at individuals who are defrauding other people. It's forcing everybody to play by the same set of rules, kind of a leveling of the playing field. The safety is one that I think has been spoken of already. By enforcing the laws against violent crime, we are hopefully having an effect, a proper effect on increasing safety. Helping victims and witnesses navigate the system. Our very first role as a prosecutor, or often the very first person we meet as a prosecutor, are the victims of crime. I mean, the police officer will come and tell us that a crime has been committed, then our next step is to meet the victim of that crime. And it is very important that as a prosecutor, we make sure that that victim knows how the system is going to work, what is expected of them, that their role is simply that of a witness, and we will be the advocate. And dealing with just witnesses, it's the same thing, because once a person has a bad involvement or interaction with the justice system, that's going to taint everything about their future reactions, and we're going to need them later on, possibly as witnesses or possibly as jurors. Determining alternatives, again, that's something that has been spoken of. We don't just lock everybody up. We can't just lock everybody up, but we have to find methods that ensure that when a person becomes engaged in the justice system from the role of a defendant, that they are that we're looking for what is going to prevent them when they are eventually released. We don't have, it's not 100% death penalty. It's not 100% incarceration until death. It is people are going to be back on the streets. So what can we do to ensure that these people do not, once they're back on the streets, engage in this conduct again or other criminal conduct again? And we have to be inventive, and we have to look to evidence-based solutions on how to reduce recidivism. And then finally, protecting the Constitution. I mean, we have to be the monitors of our own police departments. We have to be the ones who tell the police when they've overstepped the Fourth Amendment. We have to tell our jailers when they've overstepped the Eighth Amendment. And coming from the Civil Rights Division, this is something which I do on a regular basis, because we are looking at police conduct both broadly in the terms of our criminal section, and then more narrow, criminal section on specific incidents, and then more broadly with respect to our special litigation section on patterns and practices of misconduct, and ensuring that police departments operate efficiently and properly.
Roy, thanks. Particularly appreciate your comments about the role of the prosecutor vis-a-vis victims and witnesses. It's obviously been overlooked traditionally. The victims movement has come roaring into our jurisdictions, often with constitutional provisions at the state level to ensure their role, and I think it's generally been a neglected area. And of course, as you said, the role of the prosecutor and as a guardian of justice and the Constitution, particularly vis-a-vis police practices and corrections practices, is really important. Let's turn to question 2, which is, what is the effect of community prosecution, the community prosecution approach on community safety and recidivism? Before we turn, and I'm going to turn to Roy again, but maybe it'd be a good idea just to kind of sum up by summarizing again the definition of community prosecution. It focuses on target areas, involves long-term proactive partnerships among the obvious stakeholders that have been mentioned, whereby the authority of the prosecutor's office is used to solve problems, improve public safety, and enhance the quality of life in the community. Roy, let's turn to you again and indicate, and to the panelists that will be answering this, to the extent, back to the notion of evidence-based practice, to the extent any of you are aware of experience or research that confirms the effects of community prosecution on safety and recidivism, that'd be good. But Roy, give us your perspective on those effects.
Let me, I guess, in some ways tell a war story, which I'm sure the people on the webinar really don't want to hear, but let me try anyway. The place where I have been most involved in community prosecution, or a type of community prosecution, has been in the area of human trafficking. Human trafficking is something which you could very easily just kind of pick a young person off the street and find out that she has been put on the street by someone older, and do a kind of one-shot deal case and prosecute that person for statutory rape or for some kind of trafficking offense. In D.C., what we have, and actually what we have across the country, are these human trafficking task forces, which have formalized the idea of community prosecution, because what we do is we bring in all of the stakeholders. We bring in the victims' rights groups. We bring in the advocacy organizations. We bring in the state law enforcement. We bring in the federal law enforcement. And we develop ways of, first of all, outreach. How do we identify victims? How do you tell a 14, 15-year-old young lady who's on the street, that what is happening to her is in fact a crime, and get her to come forward. And then we talk about how do we operate maybe a sting operation using our state and federal resources to find both victims and to find perpetrators. And we come together and we develop plans on how we are going to bring this all together. And then we work with our victim advocacy organizations, because what we have victims here who don't have housing, don't have employment, don't have education. And while the role of the prosecutors is to make the community safe, there's only so much that we can do. And so we bring in these advocacy organizations that are able to provide housing and to provide educational resources, to provide even job training for the victims, and in an attempt to make the victim whole so the victim isn't back on the street again. And so, and what we've done is we bring the entire community together, the community of those who are involved in human trafficking work and human trafficking cases. We bring all of them together to come up with plans on how to solve a particular problem. And we use evidence-based information to determine, well, where do we do a sting operation, and where is the problem greatest? And so that is how, in the federal government, in the small area of human trafficking, we have been able to use community prosecution to our benefit, and we've found numerous good cases based on this kind of model.
Thanks, Roy. Chauncey, how about your experiences or perspective on the issue of how the recidivism and reduction of crime is affected by this approach?
I think that community prosecution is really the next frontier of public safety. I think the last 20 years have been such, for the most part, just significant declines in crime across the country, but it's really been police and prosecutors, for the most part, working side by side, effective strategies like CompStat and other things like that, technology, science like DNA. But I think that one of the missed opportunities, overall, has been the partnership with the community, which I think is probably the most important partner that we can have. And so I think that's where we're really going to get to the next level of crime reduction. I can tell you what we're doing in Manhattan with our new DA, Cy Vance. What he's done is sort of create a framework for building that partnership with the community. So in the role that I play for him as the executive ADA for crime prevention, is that we're putting together a unit called the Crime Strategies Unit, which consists of ADAs who have on average about 10 years in the office prosecuting crime and other serious offenses. They're coming out of those assignments, and we've divided Manhattan into 5 geographic areas. Each of those areas has an ADA who's responsible for doing everything we can within the office to reduce crime in that particular community, whether it's Washington Heights or Harlem or Lower Manhattan. They're partnering on their team with the community affairs officer, who up till now has been a different part of the office, is now a partner of that ADA, as well as an investigator and a crime analyst, and they form a team in each geographic area. But their role and their measure and their outcome is ultimately is crime reduction in their particular area. And they're looking at everything from, if there's a spike in violence on 145th Street in Lenox Avenue, is to figure out all the cases of the 500 ADAs in our office who have cases, they're all over the place, but who has a case in that particular geographic area, who has informants, who has intelligence, who knows what's going on in that area, so we can be most effective with our prosecution decisions. In addition, to think about things like, well, who are the people coming out of prison they're one way or the other, they're coming back home to Manhattan. Who's coming back to that precinct? And then start to try to use the bully pulpit of the DA's office to get all the key players in criminal justice and in the community and the other government organizations to say, well, what can we do to increase employment? What can we do to deal with housing and other kinds of challenges like that, all with the idea that these are just smart steps toward crime reduction. So it really, I think, this Crime Strategies Unit, which is based on a community prosecution model, will be the platform to try to synchronize the efforts of the DA's office across the office from corner to corner.
Thanks, Chauncey. It sounds like, of course, as you know, New York is well known for approaches by the police using data and holding the police accountable, typically known as CompStat. Is that essentially an approach that the district attorney is using as well in these neighborhood locations?
I think absolutely. I think you have to have a goal. If you don't have a goal, you have anecdotes. And so the goal is to reduce crime. That's the primary, and then there's all sorts of secondary measures that we can use. But the goal is ultimately to reduce crime. And I don't think it's an accident that the NYPD's reduced crime 17 years in a row. And a large part of that is their organizational strategies driven by this system called COMSTAT, which is the performance measures and the ultimate performance measure of crime reduction. So we're going to partner with them and work with them and try to enhance their efforts to reduce crime across the borough.
Thanks, Chauncey. Brent, we have a little time here. We're a little ahead of time, but we need to watch our time. But since you're the director of the National Center for Community Prosecution, I think maybe you could point our audience in specifically to any research or evidence that suggests the impact of community prosecution on safety and recidivism. Anything you can cite to our audience?
One of the difficulties in having any empirical research and studies about the effect of community prosecution on public safety is that, from a prosecutor standpoint of view, we've always judged our success on conviction rates. So if you have a new training or a new program, it's like, are we getting better evidence? Are we taking better cases to court, and therefore have our conviction rates gone up or gone down? And a lot of times prosecutors historically haven't been as involved in, what are we doing as prosecutors to reduce recidivism? We sort of look at that as the purview of corrections or counseling or the treatment professionals, which certainly it is. But as prosecutors become involved in partnerships with corrections and the rest of the community, we're starting to look at, well, how can we prove that what we're doing is effective? And there is a whole lot of anecdotal studies or information that's out there from parks that are now safe for kids to play in, to streets, and to reduce calls for service and that sort of thing. But it's kind of hard to, one, agree on how you're going to measure it. What are the quantitative elements that you're going to survey or evaluate to determine its effectiveness, and whether or not you've got the historical data to compare it to. I will like to refer people to a couple things. I understand these will be available on the FAQ sheet at the conclusion of the webinar. But NDAA has performed some evaluations. They're a couple years old, but we have them available for free download on our website, ndaa.org. I will also say that there are a couple of other organizations that are heavily involved in the community prosecution effort. One is the Center for Court Innovation, which is located in Manhattan. That's courtinnovation.org. Also, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys has a good community prosecution program, and they're working with the Bureau of Justice Assistance on what is called the Community Prosecution Advisory Council, and they're working right now on some evaluation mechanisms and some performance measures so that we can try to quantify the effect and the effectiveness of community prosecution. So right now there's a lot of anecdotal stuff where those of us that are involved in community prosecution, and when we see the improved cooperation of the community with law enforcement, we see that, we feel it, but it's hard to count the beans and say this is what we've done that's really been an improvement under community prosecution.
Yeah. Thanks, Brent. Well, we look forward to the evolution of more research in the area. Let's turn to question 3. How has the development of partnerships in the community helped you in the pursuit of justice? And we've heard already from Chauncey about the importance of it in New York and how the district attorney is organized in neighborhoods and the importance of partnerships. But let's back to you, Brent. Your perspective on how the development of partnerships in the community has helped with community justice.
Well, I think, and this was touched on a little bit briefly, some of what I'm going to talk about. We have, as prosecutors, engaged in partnerships for years. We have a number of kind of traditional partners that we as prosecutors use, and those are law enforcement, and corrections. If you look back 30 or 40 years, we would have considered, the police and the sheriff's departments, highway patrol, whatever, to be our partners, as well as those folks either in community corrections, in probation and parole, or in institutional corrections, whether it's prisons or county jails. A number of decades and a few years ago, we started to bring in a few other potential partners for prosecutors. We started looking at victim advocacy groups and victim advocates, which has been a tremendous asset and partner for prosecution. And then we also started to look at treatment professionals as being a partner where we could actually bring them into part of some of our programs and what we're doing in the courtroom so that we could understand how we could better perhaps structure plea negotiations or whatever to help both victims and offenders. But you also see partnerships with schools, whether it's the DARE program or the GREAT program, where law enforcement and prosecutors are involved in getting out to schools and getting their cooperation and partnership. Hospitals, from sexual assault response teams, where we're providing training to them about what we need for admissibility, whether it's statements from a domestic violence victim or how to do a sexual assault nurse examination or anything of that nature. There's a lot of the partnership with the medical profession that we do. We're starting to see, I think, for the biggest and most impressive impact and partnership that we've seen in community prosecution is that with the business community, whether it's a central business district or whether it's, for example, there are a number of large box retail stores. Target Corporation, for example, a very good partner for law enforcement because we've started to realize amongst the big box stores and other retailers is that this organized retail crime that is more than just shoplifting. It's a huge impact on our community, and there's, believe it or not, gang involvement in organized retail crime, and so it's more than just an economic hit to these organizations. So we receive a lot of information. We share intelligence with business groups, and they share it with us. So it becomes a great partnership. They want to help law enforcement because they want to be a good corporate partner and a corporate community member, and we want to get their information from them and their help in identifying what are potential problems that are happening at their stores. And the one thing as community prosecution goes, when you assign prosecutors to specific neighborhoods, you're able to assess the needs of that one particular neighborhood, because a partnership that you have in one area of your city may not be effective or may not be needed in another area of your city. And so by putting those prosecutors in a neighborhood-specific office, then they get the opportunity to say, okay, what are our problems here? What are our problems in the other neighborhood? And so that they can better identify the specific problems and the specific partnerships that are needed for that particular neighborhood. And one last point I want to make on this is that whenever we partner with any organization, whether it's a school or a hospital or a retail association, we have to understand that those partnerships, those organizations are made up of people in the community. And so when they see an institutional and corporate trust between business and law enforcement and the prosecutor's office, that translates to an increased individual trust, so that they're more likely to call if they're a witness or a victim of a crime. They're more likely to cooperate. And as was mentioned earlier, they may potentially be jurors for us at one point. So it really helps prosecution in improving that trust with the community.
Thanks, Brent. Roy, your perspective on partnerships?
Yeah, let me talk about it in two forms. One, from the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, what Brent was just mentioning. We have a prosecutor in every police district whose job it is not to bring cases, but to develop better relationships with community members. And the important thing about community policing and community prosecution is building long-lasting and trusting relationships. So the way it is done in D.C. is you have this prosecutor who is on the ground talking to people, available to people on a regular basis. But you also have a vertical prosecution model where from the time people are in misdemeanors, they are put into districts. So you get to know your law enforcement officers. Unfortunately, the people who end up coming through the criminal justice system are often the same people. Your Your victim one day may be your defendant one day, maybe the next day may be your witness the next day, but you get to know these people. And the
Excuse me, Roy, when you said vertical prosecution, this is an attorney following the prosecutor, following the case through its evolution, through its progress?
Exactly. In other words, the person who does the intake of the case is the person who's going to do the first appearance in the case, is going to be the person who argues the motions, is going to do the trial, is potentially going to do some of the appellate work in the case. And so you, instead of just having, one line do kind of all of your intake work and then another line doing all of your motions work, another line doing so in other words, the victim, for one, is going to see the same prosecutor from day one through the end of the system. But in some ways also now your community is going to see the same group of prosecutors who are going to be working on these cases. And so when the prosecutor goes out with the law enforcement officer to investigate the scene of a crime, that person is going to be the same. They're going to see that person. They're going to recognize that person. The other thing is for prosecutors to end up going to community meetings. You go and you attend community meetings and attend community events so that you become a face in that community that people can turn to and kind of whisper things to as they become witnesses of crime. So sometimes they may not want to be the person or they may only have hearsay information, but they can put you in the right direction. It is the need to develop long-lasting and trusting relationships with your community and finding a means to do so. Then on from the main justice side of things, we have two huge community resources that we use to develop these partnerships. One is obviously our Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. This is our COPS program run by Barney Malekian. And for anybody interested, you can go to www.cops.usdoj.gov. And it talks about a lot of the work that is done there on a very formal basis, working with police departments, but also then the ability to work with prosecutors. We also have what's called the Community Relations Service, that's CRS, and this is a group of non-lawyers primarily who are around the country meeting with all of these different advocacy groups and all these different stakeholders and establishing relationships that can then be used whenever, for example, if a riot is brewing or there's a bad incident, they are the first ones on the ground. But they can also, we are using them now a lot for if we have something that we're trying to roll out, to help people, to introduce people to something like, for example, we now have new hate crimes legislation. Finding all of the groups who need to hear this and then developing the partnerships that we can then use to enforce the crime, enforce the law when there have been crimes.
Thanks very much, Roy.